So, in the context of this climate catastrophe, an infrastructure bill, and a brand new IPCC report on the status of climate change, I am extremely honored to be joined by two powerhouses in the field. Eric Holthaus, meteorologist, journalist, and author of The Future Earth, and founder of Currently. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And Peter Kalmus, NASA technical scientist speaking on his own behalf and author of Being the Change, Live Well, and Spark a Climate Revolution. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Brie.
So first and foremost, for folks who don't know a lot about the IPCC report and what it means, what is it and what new, if anything, is it telling us about the state of this climate emergency?
So the IPCC report it's a massive synthesis report created by over 200 of the world's best climate scientists over the last few years. And what it does is it takes all of the recent research and synthesizes it into one place, digests it, and creates summaries for policymakers too, which I think is really critical, and communicates the best state of climate science to the world, basically. So, scientists, we work every day on our research. We publish papers in the peer-reviewed journals, and you get a paper here, a paper there on this topic, on that topic. Very, very hard for the public or policymakers to digest the individual peer-reviewed papers. So it's critical to have these sorts of summary reports every few years that just make sense of all of the recent research for the world.
Yeah, and I would say the critical thing here, too, is that the summary for policymakers, like Peter mentioned, is approved line by line by all the world's governments. And so this is a consensus document. Every country has veto power, and that goes back to the scientist itself. If a government wants to veto it, the scientist can override that veto. So this is not only a consensus science document, but it's a consensus political document too. So that's directly meant to feed into the UNFCCC negotiations later this fall. So this is all the world's heads of state that are getting together to say, how are we going to improve from the Paris Agreement 5 years ago? How can we ramp up climate action around the world? So this is a really powerhouse document in that sense.
So what is the consensus, gentlemen? I suspect we're not getting top marks.
Well, so there aren't really surprises, right, in some sense, because the world scientists have been raising these alarms for decades and, largely being ignored by policymakers, which is frankly extremely frustrating. But I would say the bottom line is that all of the climate catastrophes that we're living through right now are going to keep getting worse until we stop burning fossil fuels. So the bottom line of this entire report is that we need to end the fossil fuel industry as soon as possible. And even some of the very top people in the United Nations are starting to say this very forthrightly, which is kind of a new thing, at least in my opinion, that we haven't really seen so much of in previous years. Top officials, leading scientists coming straight out directly saying we need to end the fossil fuel industry. And then I will add one point too, which isn't in the report, but which is my opinion, which is that the world still hasn't really started seeing a second kind of a set of impacts yet that I think are going to start coming in future years, which are sort of the breakdown of social structures, human structures that we depend on, like infrastructure and food systems and water systems and geopolitics, as more and more climate migrants have to start moving from places that become too hot, where it's impossible for them to grow food anymore, and they're experiencing famines, et cetera, and they have to move to other places, and that's going to be incredibly destabilizing. So, we have the physical impacts, the fires, the floods, the heat waves that we're seeing right now, and those will get worse. And then I think at the same time in the future, I expect to start seeing impacts of sort of as human systems are pushed to their sort of messy breaking points.
So Peter, I'm hearing you say we need to end the we need to dramatically cut carbon emissions. We need to, how did you put it, in the fossil fuel industry? I am not hearing language that's quite that intense coming out of these Biden administration infrastructure talks. Now, I didn't hear language that fulsome being used even before we got into this negotiation stage, where now a lot of the compromising is attributed to the Republicans and conservative Democrats who would want to ratchet it back from perhaps where the Biden administration would start. But even going into it, we were talking about measures that were less than what needed to be done to meet the moment, as evidenced by the Sunrise Movement giving Joe Biden famously an F grade going into the primary, or in the midst of the primary. Of course, once Joe Biden was the nominee, ultimately there was a certain degree of coalescing around him. And my concern is that coalescing behind him in the effort to make sure that he won out over Trump obscured the extent to which the place that the Biden administration was coming to in the first instance was already well below the interventions necessary to actually ward off the worst effects of climate change.
One other thing missing from this document is that in the summary for policymakers, they don't mention fossil fuels at all. It's completely eliminated out of that document. So they talk about human action. Which humans, like who are they acting on? That's the political sort of like statement from climate scientists that has been missed in the mainstream media coverage of this report. It's very clear if you look through the report itself, which is like 1,900 pages, which, there's a handful of us that have ever even opened that document probably. They call out the fossil fuel industry in there. So the scientists itself know that human action is responsible for 98% of rising temperatures over the last, century. And it's only when we ratchet back the fossil fuel industry on an emergency timescale will we start to see changes in improvements in sort of like the human rights. I would call it human rights abuses that the fossil fuel industry is inflicting on the most vulnerable people in the world, the people who have contributed least to this problem.
So, Eric, we're talking about taking emissions down to zero. I'm reading from this August 12th article in The New Yorker, where Bill McKibben is interviewing Lee Stokes. And she's explaining that, that Biden has committed to cutting carbon pollution 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. I see that said a lot. Biden has committed to. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I don't know if there's a contract somewhere where he signed his name in blood, kind of Ariel, Little Mermaid style. But without more, that already gives me a little bit of skepticism. So even taking that at face value, he's committed to cutting carbon pollution 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. That seems on its face also not going down to zero. I understand that logistically things don't happen overnight, but let's take that. She goes on to say, if we can get to 80% clean power by 2030 with these power sector investments, that will get us more than halfway to the White House's goal. To secure other pollution cuts, we need big investments on clean cars and clean buildings and many other policies. At the same time, what we're seeing is already an enormous ratcheting back from the original, even Biden administration's agenda in these infrastructure bills. So in the bipartisan bill, my understanding is that there's next to nothing that actually goes toward this issue of carbon emissions. There's actually nothing about lowering carbon emissions.
Except for increased highway funding, right? Expanding roads, which is the fossil fuel infrastructure.
Sure. So I guess the idea is we'll build the roads and we'll just hope and pray that they put electric cars on them.
Right. Yeah, that's the plan.
Okay. Yeah, so to this point, just this real quick point about the electric cars. Apparently, I just want to get this stat out, this fact out on the table. Stokes also says the scale of spending is inadequate for many critical climate issues, while President Biden has proposed around $50 billion in spending to build 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations across the country, which would go some way to hoping that it's electric cars and not the regular schmegular ones that get put on these new roads. The bill only has about $5 billion for this effort. So from 50 to 5. Okay. Similarly, when it comes to electrifying school buses, a policy that would protect children's health, the bipartisan bill falls short. Biden proposed spending $20 billion in investment that would have electrified around 20% of the school bus fleet. Okay. So the original, again, was only going to electrify 20% of the school bus fleet. And the final deal only includes $2.5 billion. So from 20 to 2.5, which will replace around 8,000 school buses, or less than 3% of the national fleet.
What
are we doing here?
Yeah. It's really frustrating, I think, because, the U.S. has the largest historical climate footprint of any country in the world. We should be going above. So that 50 to 52% by 2030, that's in line with global average Paris Agreement goals. So that means we're just doing the average, that 50 to, like, we could easily do, not easily, but it's technically achievable for us to do 80% emissions reductions by 2030. We could and should go above that 50 to 52% by 2030. We could electrify all of the school buses in the United States this year if we wanted to. Like, it's just a question of whether or not we want to. And it seems like we don't want to right now, in terms of those priorities and the way that it keeps getting ratcheted back. But we have a responsibility as the world's leading historic emitter to go above and beyond the average. We have to go above the Paris Agreement goals to give space for countries who have contributed lower amounts of carbon historically, give them more time to put in place renewable energy that we can easily do today.
And if you take a step back, there's a couple of really big picture problems with this whole setup. All right. So one of them is that these kinds of 2030, 2050 timescales, they basically let politicians completely off the hook, right? So I want to know what the Biden administration is doing right now, this month, by the end of the year, what they're planning to do next year, what they're planning to do by 2023. I want a year-by-year progression that says how much is this actually going to take down our emissions, how much, and then we can see if it's actually going in the right direction.
That's an emergency plan, right?
That's what we need. This administration right now, as far as I can see, is actually doing what it can to expand the fossil fuel industry. And that's what's really terrifying to me. So, just 2 days after the report came out, Biden was begging OPEC to increase production, right? He's still been supportive of new oil pipelines, the dirtiest oil from the tar sands in the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. He's still supportive of that. He's been increasing the rate of drilling for fracking on public lands. I mean, it's the old adage, right? If you're stuck in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. Well, he's digging faster and faster. And there's no sign of that stopping right now. So on one hand, he gets to pay this lip service. Oh, by 2030, we can do this. And on the other side, he's actually increasing the infrastructure to create new, every new power plant's going to last for like 40 years, right? So every new pipeline has this this is how capitalism works. We build new fossil fuel infrastructure now. It's basically a death sentence. And then the second big picture thing that I would say is what I would consider kind of new information from the last couple of summers that we've had, which is that it was long widely assumed, I think, by policymakers, with actually very little evidence, that 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating above pre-industrial levels was the so-called safe level. I think we can probably start to agree now, after the heat dome event in the Pacific Northwest, after the massive flooding we've been seeing all around the world, after these fires in Siberia and Turkey and Greece and Algeria and California and the West Coast, just the way it turns out these ecosystems, these forest ecosystems, are very more sensitive than we thought to drought and high temperatures. And it looks to me like they've sort of passed a sort of tipping point. And we're at 1.1 degrees, 1.2 degrees Celsius of global heating right now. And to me, that's clearly not a safe level. So that would say to me that these goals, all of the carbon budgets that we had for 1.5 degrees Celsius, for 2 degrees Celsius of global heating, we kind of have to throw those out the window right now, because what we sort of assumed might be so-called safe levels don't to me at least, they don't look like anything but right now.
There is an urgency I feel in this conversation that the three of us are having that I've got to say I often feel is missing from climate conversations, even though climate conversations are very often very doom and gloom. You know, there's a gravity to them, but not an urgency, if that makes sense. Because what I feel like, and let me know if you think I'm being overly cynical, what I feel like is because there is no connection between the drama that's unfolding on our planet and the political possibility of correcting it and a concentration on who's responsible and who could be doing something different, whether it's the Biden administration, whether it's the 90 companies that are responsible for all the pollution, you know, because there's no naming names and no accountability mechanism, it does end up going into this doomer space that is heavy without being urgent and seems to have the effect of demobilizing people, frankly.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, it's like the stifling, despairing sort of feeling, right? Yeah, so I think we're in a just an absolute emergency, and I agree with you. I think that's sort of missing. You know, I think that the fossil fuel industry is being protected by nation states still, and that's a huge problem. It's being protected by the legal system. You have these incredibly courageous activists like Jessica Resnicek, who she actually engaged in some sabotage to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, and she was sentenced on July 1st to 8 years in prison, even though she hurt nobody except for some corporate property. And the judge explicitly said that she wanted to make an example of Jessica to discourage other, kind of forms of extreme direct activism to save the planet for future generations. So, it's social norms are incredibly strong. Most of us have grown up with fossil fuels. Most of us have grown up flying in planes. Most of us have grown up feeling that, a lot of older people, I think, kind of equate fossil fuel with progress and with America's kind of power in the world and sort of good things and sort of helping people, come up out of poverty, et cetera. When I see it as this deadly substance that we should do everything that we can at every scale to stop burning this stuff. I mean, it's really, to me, the connection between burning this fossil fuel and what we're seeing now is just, and what's coming in the future. Like I have this weird thing in my brain where maybe it's because I'm a scientist. So when I see projections for 5 years or 10 years or towards the end of the century, and I see no political action to stop it, it feels to me emotionally almost like it's happening right now. Right. So I think that's where my sense of urgency comes from. But there's so many disconnects in this space, again, across scales. There's collective disconnects. There's cognitive dissonance. There's climate denial, I think, is a lot more complicated than most people understand. It's not just Trump saying it's a Chinese hoax. There's a whole spectrum of denial. And I think it interacts with our psychology in incredibly complex ways.
Yeah, Peter, these old heads they didn't grow up with Fern Gully and that big oil monster. If they had, we'd been living in a different America. Sorry, Eric, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that the Paris talks in 2015 were really led morally and ethically by Pacific Islanders who saw these projections and said, 1.5 degrees, that is the absolute highest we should ever get. And they there were heads of state calling it genocide. Which it really is,
I completely agree.
If you have an entire nation state that disappears from the face of the map, it no longer physically exists. It's there, but it's below the water. What happens to the traditions? What happens to the homelands? What happens to the literal cemeteries of ancestors where people have lived there for thousands and thousands of years? This is their place, and it's being taken from them. Like that is to me, like I can see that happening, just like Peter said. Like I see that happening now. This is another thing that the report said this week. With every ton of carbon that's emitted, we are locking in future warming, and that to me creates anger and urgency and this like drive of like we have to do like that's what that's what drives me to really feel this at a visceral level. Is like that is sea level rise is one thing that is irreversible on timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. So we are locking that in, and there is no physical way for us to pull that back out of the atmosphere once it's there.
I completely agree, and I just wanted to add that the people on the front lines and the people in the global south who've done the least to create this problem, they have skin in the game, and for them, this is a life or death matter, and for more and more people, it's going to become a life or death matter. One of the really interesting things about the heat dome, I think, is that people in the global north, well-off people, globally rich people, finally started to realize, maybe some of them for the first time, that they actually weren't safe either. And part of the big problem I see here is that the global elites, the people in the Biden administration, the heads of state, the fossil fuel executives in their private jets, they're not yet feeling the frontline effects of this. They don't have skin in the game. I think they're under this delusion that they can go to their bunkers in New Zealand and ride it out and be fine. And I don't think they, or even the public generally, is cognizant enough of what Eric said, which is that this is essentially irreversible. And the only reason, I'm sorry for being dark, but the only reason I put that word essentially in there is because, sure, after 10 million years, biodiversity will recover. So you can't say it's completely irreversible. On deep time, it is. But for any time scale relevant to a human life or to even human civilizations,
Human society,
yeah, this is effectively irreversible. The forest loss, the extra heat, the sea level rise, the loss of ice sheets, and the biodiversity loss has the longest time scale. They can look at fossil records and look at previous mass extinction events, and it takes millions of years, roughly 10 million years, for biodiversity to completely recover.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid in the mid-90s, I remember sitting in like my 5th grade classroom, and there were posters of polar bears on the wall. We would get lessons, on the ice cap, we would get lessons about how this number of species went extinct this year. And oh my God, what if they killed the frog that had the enzyme that could cure cancer, or the plant or whatever. And this is how much plant biodiversity we're losing because this many acres of the Amazon. And I remember having this feeling like it was a ticking clock, and it was so urgent. Acid rain, ozone. It felt like, I remember feeling actual panic about it. And like every second we were even talking about it in class it represented opportunities lost in terms of the medicine and all these other kind of things that we get from our world. And I don't know what happened to that sense of urgency. I remember when the Deepwater Horizon spill happened, I was in law school taking an environmental law class with Jody Friedman, who went to join the Obama administration later. And when that happened, it was, holy crap, unprecedented volumes of oil are being dumped into the ocean every second that we're sitting here in this lecture. And then at a certain point, it almost feels like it's so much that we just check out. It's too much. So cognitively, we just check out.
Yeah, I think a very important thing to keep in mind when you feel yourself hitting into this, like, oh, and then this is going to happen, and this is happen, and then we're screwed. Like none of this is ever going to be achievable. I think we have to cognitively counter that in our heads of saying that take a second, take a deep breath, and say, imagine what is the world that I am fighting for? Like, what is the world where all of this could be achieved faster than I think would be possible?
So what does that look like, Eric? Because you wrote a book about this question, right? And did I see you, or was it Peter that was tweeting to George Takei about being a Star Trek fan?
Yeah, that was me.
Oh, it was you, Peter?
I share Eric's vision to a large extent too, and I've read his book, and I think that kind of work is really important to start developing this vision.
So Eric, paint us a picture, because I often allude to Star Trek as the reason why I feel more able and more willing to imagine what this more utopian future looks like. practically speaking, to those who think, yeah, sure, it'd be great to fix everything, but you said we could we could electrify all the school buses by the end of the year. Could we really go beyond the climate goals that are being set by the Paris Climate Accords? What does that look like? What kind of mobilization would that take? Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.